Bipartisanship saved the day in Washington just hours before the federal government was set to shut down yesterday. But the short-term bill passed does not include new aid for Ukraine, which is a top priority for the White House. President Biden is now urging Congress to approve additional support for the embattled country. For more on this, we're joined by senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe. Ed, President Biden said it is time to end governing by crisis. What does he mean? And tell us more about how the president reacted to the averted government shutdown.
He means what every other president has said in modern times, which is stop working up until the deadline and get it done already. Congress once again acting like college kids cramming the night before to turn in their thesis on deadline, and he says that's got to stop. But more critically now here at the White House, watch this week for what they may do, what kind of pressure they may apply on Congress to pass funding for the Ukraine war and what that might look like. There is conversation about should the White House be sending Congress a request for, let's say, a year's worth of money that would take the U.S. financial aid effort through beyond next year's election to ensure that this issue is kind of just shoved aside and not made political even more so next year during the campaign season. White House may be amenable to that, but it's going to be a big number. And so then it'll just be a question of getting a vote, not necessarily in the Senate, where there is enough support to get it done, but in the House, where there's still enough support, but there's obviously a speaker who's waiting to see whether he'll still be speaker by the end of this week. So that's where a lot of his time, attention, and focus will be for the president in the coming days, is ensuring that that happens, knowing that a majority of Americans want it to happen. Otherwise, some displeasure that it had to happen this way, but relief that the government is open.
One thing I've noticed about the president sort of recently, say in the last month or so, is he's become much less diplomatic with his words when he's talking about the former president, when he's talking about some of these more right-leaning Republicans in Congress. And in an interview with ProPublica Friday, President Biden compared the House Republicans attempting to bring Washington to a halt through the government shutdown to Trump's effort to regain the presidency. What else did the president talk about in that?
Well, what he's alluding to, Anne-Marie, is the idea that there is a block of what he calls extremist MAGA Republicans in Congress who are, in essence, helping the former president get reelected and seize back power. And so they're the ones causing these disruptions that have caused the House to go into chaos and try to determine exactly how basic things like keeping the government's lights on will work, whether or not Kevin McCarthy will still be speaker, denying or opposing aid to Ukraine despite overwhelming bipartisan majorities of Americans who say there should be at least some financial assistance, even if increasingly there are calls to make sure that that money is more closely tracked. So, he's done that. He had this speech last week in Arizona, in Tempe, Arizona, where he talked about his concerns about the future of American democracy and implied that the U.S. Constitution, that democracy generally remains a threat so long as Donald Trump sits atop the Republican Party. So yes, it's going to continue to be something he talks about, because not only is it something that has concerned him since before he began running for president in 2019, but they also know here at the White House in a more crass political way that it polls well, that there is widespread majority concern across the country about the future of democracy. It may be primarily people concerned about how, as the White House calls them, extremist MAGA Republicans and the former president would run things. But there are also, of course, conservative Republicans, or those that align themselves with the former president, concerned about democracy because they believe that the Justice Department is unfairly targeting him. Although, as you heard the Attorney General say a little while ago, that's not the way it works. So it's an issue, much like many others that are out there. But it's one, at least this president believes, he's uniquely qualified to talk about, focus on, campaign on, and will hopefully, in his view at least, reap the advantages of it going forward.
All right, Ed, thank you.